Well, today is an historic day, a truly historic day in the Trump presidency, in this country. It is an historic day in the 229-year history of the American presidency because today we did really arrive at the Fifth Avenue moment.
I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and I wouldn't lose any voters, okay?
Today was that day. Today, the president appeared to commit a crime in public. And for the last 2.5 years, since Donald Trump said he could shoot someone on Fifth Avenue and get away with it, he has been preparing his voters for this day. And he has been preparing the Republican Party for this day. And he has been preparing the American news media for this day. And the president's plan appears to have worked. He has successfully brainwashed his voters to the point where they just don't accept what they don't just accept what he did today. They will cheer for it. They do cheer for it. And as we saw last night, they will scream and curse and threaten any reporters who challenge the president in any way for the Fifth Avenue moment today. The Republican Party, which sent 16 candidates into battle with Donald Trump for the Republican presidential nomination, has completely surrendered to Donald Trump. And those defeated Republican candidates who still have jobs in the United States Senate, where they could control the Trump presidency, have completely surrendered to the Trump presidency. They all appear completely brainwashed now. We have never seen anything like this in American politics. And today is the day that the president needed them to all be brainwashed. Senator Ted Cruz said absolutely nothing today, not one word, when Donald Trump had his Fifth Avenue moment, when Donald Trump publicly obstructed justice today, which he did in more than one way, which we will get into in a moment. Not one word from Ted Cruz about that today. And here is what that same Ted Cruz said about the president 2 years ago.
This man is a pathological liar. He doesn't know the difference between truth and lies. He lies practically every word that comes out of his mouth. The man cannot tell the truth, but he combines it with being a narcissist. A narcissist at a level I don't think this country's ever seen. The man is utterly amoral. Morality does not exist for him.
Now Ted Cruz worships at the altar of Donald Trump. Ted Cruz has forgiven every sin Donald Trump committed against him, against his father, and the horrible things he said about Ted Cruz's wife. Ted Cruz has even forced his young children to shake the hand of the man he called utterly amoral. Marco Rubio did not sound afraid of Donald Trump 2 years ago.
He's a con man. I think it's time to unmask him for what he is.
I will not allow the conservative movement to be taken over by a con artist by the name of Donald Trump.
And today, that same person sounded brainwashed.
President Trump is calling on Sessions to end this quote-unquote rigged witch hunt right now.
I know, he said that before. I've already told you guys my feelings about it. So I think Mueller should finish his work, and the truth is what is going to be good for the president and good for the country.
He said that before. No, he hasn't said that before. The Trump brainwashing is working. When Donald Trump says something outrageous and criminal that he has never said before, and it sounds like he has said it before, it's the brainwashing that makes it feel that way. The 1.5 years of beating down any and all Republican resistance to the point where every new, crazy, illegal thing that the president does feels familiar, feels like a place we've already been. We are in a new place tonight, though. Thanks to the president's tweet this morning saying Attorney General Jeff Sessions should stop this rigged witch hunt right now before it continues to stain our country any further. Bob Mueller is totally conflicted, and his 17 angry Democrats that are doing his dirty work are a disgrace to USA! Exclamation point. There are 2 potential crimes in that tweet, 2. One of which has not been mentioned at all today. And our first guest tonight, Jill Wine-Banks, noticed it, and she and I will discuss it in depth later in this hour. Democrats were outraged by the president's obvious attempt at obstruction of justice today. But Republicans, in their surrender to Trumpism, have forgotten what they used to think about special prosecutors' investigations of presidents of the United States.
Mr. President, I'm deeply troubled today because Judge Starr's pursuit of the truth is being undermined every step of the way, every single day in the press by those whose sole mission is to attack and impugn the court-appointed independent prosecutor and the congressionally created process. And these attackers are not the journalists or the broadcasters. Mr. President, what troubles me the most here is that these reckless attacks, these ruthless onslaughts, are being carried out by the closest advisors to the President of the United States. My point here, Mr. President, is simple. The attacks on Kenneth Starr are unfounded and unproductive. The attacks are, in fact, unconscionable.
Unconscionable. This is the moment in Mitch McConnell's career when standing up to the unconscionable is the most important thing he can do. It is the most important moment in Mitch McConnell's career. And there will not be a video library that lives forever in history showing what Mitch McConnell had to say at this point in the challenge that Donald Trump presents to the United States of America, because Mitch McConnell has been so silent at every turn. In history, we will be turning to the blank tape of Mitch McConnell saying nothing about what Donald Trump does. That Mitch McConnell was silent today. He was silent today in the face of a president publicly obstructing justice. Mitch McConnell could not find one word to say about it. Presidents of the United States cannot comment on ongoing criminal investigations and prosecutions, and Mitch McConnell used to know that. Everyone knew that. Prior to Donald Trump, it only happened once in the modern history of the presidency, and it was a shocking mistake made by the well-trained lawyer turned president, Richard Nixon.
I noted, for example, the coverage of the Charles Manson case when I was in Los Angeles. Front page every day in the papers. It usually got a couple of minutes in the evening news. Here is a man who was guilty, directly or indirectly, of 8 murders without reason.
And the country and the news media were stunned because the problem was Charles Manson was still on trial for those murders when the President of the United States said that he was guilty. And so immediately that very day in court in Los Angeles, Charles Manson's lawyers moved for a mistrial in the case because the President of the United States prejudiced the outcome. President Nixon's press secretary immediately issued a statement saying that the president did not mean to suggest that Charles Manson was guilty. And later that same day, President Nixon issued a carefully written statement saying, "I do not know and did not intend to speculate as to whether the Sharon Tate defendants are guilty in fact or not. All of the facts in the case have not yet been presented." The Manson trial judge was able to deny the motion for a mistrial only because he believed no damage was done by the president's comments, because the jury was sequestered in the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles, where they were not allowed to read or hear any comments about the case. But Paul Manafort's jury is not sequestered. They are going home every night with an instruction from the judge to not read or listen to anything about the case. So the Manafort jurors are at home tonight in a country where the President of the United States today called the prosecutors in their case angry Democrats who are doing dirty work. Richard Nixon, at his worst moment, wouldn't dare call the lawyers defending Charles Manson a disgrace to the USA, and that is exactly what the President of the United States called Paul Manafort's prosecutors today, a disgrace to USA. So the president is actively interfering in a current prosecution in court, and he is trying to stop any other prosecutions brought by Robert Mueller and stop the Mueller investigation entirely. And he did all of that in public today because his lawyer told him to. Last week, Rudy Giuliani said, if you're going to obstruct justice, you do it quietly and secretly, not in public. Giuliani is insisting now that it is impossible to publicly obstruct justice. And today, Rudy Giuliani's defense that the president was not obstructing justice with his tweet turned on the meaning of the word should.
What it is, as we said immediately, it's an opinion. And he used his He used a medium that he uses for opinions, Twitter. And I mean, one of the good things about using that is he's established a clear sort of practice now that he expresses his opinions on Twitter. He used the word should. He didn't use the word must. And there was no presidential directive that followed it. He didn't direct him. He didn't direct him to do it. And he's not going to direct him to do it.
Should. Rudy Giuliani told the Washington Post, quote, he very carefully used the word should. On the advice of his lawyer, did Rudy Giuliani advise the president to use the word should in his tweet so he could defend him publicly against obstruction of justice and base that defense entirely on that one word, should? What most Republicans and much of the news media has lost sight of is that presidents must not give their opinions about ongoing criminal investigations and prosecutions. There is no innocent version of a president of the United States putting his finger on the scales of justice with his opinion about criminal investigations and prosecutions. But a year and a half into the Trump presidency, the president today decided he was ready to say the thing that he had not publicly said before. Attorney General Jeff Sessions should stop this rigged witch hunt right now. If there was a tape of Donald Trump saying that in the White House today, it would be the smoking gun in an obstruction of justice case. But Rudy Giuliani has told him to do his obstructing in public as if he was standing on Fifth Avenue with a gun. There was a deeply perverse twist in Donald Trump's tweet today. Right after he tells Jeff Sessions to stop the Mueller investigation, Attorney General Jeff Sessions should stop this rigged witch hunt right now before it continues to stain our country any further. There is now not a day that goes by that Donald Trump and Rudy Giuliani don't find new ways to continue to stain our country. Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.